Allez-y, mon cher, écrivez. Madame Tussaud serait née en Suisse, à Berne.
At the age of nearly 80, a remarkable woman set out to dictate her memoirs.
Madame Tisot was born in Berne in 1761. Since coming to England, she has taken full advantage of its benefits.
Pleinement profité de tous ses avantages. Et ses talents.
Her talents have been appreciated by a generous and enlightened public.
Aussi généreux qu'éclairé.
In an astonishing life that spanned both the French and industrial revolutions, this extraordinary mother and entrepreneur traveled across the Channel to England to create a unique brand based on famous people modeled in wax.
Écrivez, 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 écrivez.
Determined to leave an account of who she was and the times she lived through, her memoirs, letters, and papers offer a unique insight into the creation of the world-famous empire which bears her name, Mmadám Tissot.
Madame Tussaud, I think, was an amazing businesswoman.
To me, Madame Tussaud represents a creative force.
C'est une artiste, mais elle est aussi au cœur du pouvoir.
Épargnée par les massacres, libérée de la prison.
But what she said about her life is not necessarily the truth. So I feel that in her hands, the truth itself is as molten as wax.
In 1838, at her home in Baker Street, Madame Tussaud dictated her memoirs to her friend Francis Hervé. Written in the third person, she sought to create a lasting legacy.
Her father, who died before her birth, was of the military profession, and his name, Grosholz, was renowned.
Marie Tussaud seemed to mind about her social status to the extent that she rather embellished her family background. So, for example, even something as straightforward as place of birth and parentage, as presented by her, proves to be incorrect.
Marie Tussaud's story begins in Strasbourg, not the well-to-do Bern as she claimed, where she was born into a far from illustrious family.
La famille Grosholz est une famille particulière à cause du métier exercé par les garçons de cette famille, ou par les hommes de cette famille. Ces hommes sont fils de bourreaux. Comme les bourreaux exercent de père en fils, quelqu'un qui est fils de bourreau ne pourra pratiquement qu'être bourreau lui-même. Pour les filles de bourreau, c'est pareil. Elles ne peuvent, malheureusement pour elles, qu'épouser un fils de bourreau. Et Marie Grosholz n'a d'autre solution pour avancer dans la vie de cacher ses origines.
When Marie's father died before she was born, her mother turned for support to her brother-in-law, a local doctor and anatomist turned wax modeler in Bern.
Philip Curtius is crucial to her story for the following reasons. He employed her mother as a domestic housekeeper. He became very attached to the young girl, and he clearly taught her her skills.
Philippe Curtius was something of a celebrity in Bern.
Voyons voir.
He was consulted for his medical and anatomical knowledge, and his wax models were very much in demand.
Philip Curtius had learned anatomy and taught himself to make wax anatomical models, because in the mid-18th century it became less easy to secure dead corpses to chop up. So people started to make wax models to learn about anatomy and to teach about anatomy.
During that period, modelling in wax was very much in vogue. Representations were often most beautifully executed and to such perfection.
So Marie, as a small child in Paris, watched Curtius. He allowed her to try out working with the wax, found that she was a very apt and quick learner, and taught her the trade.
He was an extremely accomplished modeler, and the tinting of the wax so that it replicated flesh, he passed that skill on to her. So she was an apprentice almost to this enigmatic man.
As his fame grew, Curtius decided to open a second exhibition in the Boulevard du Temple.
Le principal lieu qui va faire connaître Curtius mondialement, hein, c'est le boulevard du Temple. La grande spécialité, et ce qui attire évidemment un public très large, hein, c'est la caverne des voleurs. Hein, c'est les assassins, c'est les grands criminels du temps.
Alongside the criminals, Curtius placed busts of the celebrities of the day, a formula that would later make Mme Tussaud world famous herself. Now an accomplished model maker, Marie was fully involved in the making of the waxworks. As her skills increased, so too did her reputation, at least according to her memoirs.
Francis, je continue. Parmi les membres de la famille royale,
among the members of the royal family, who would often call in at the apartments and admire Curtius's works and those of his niece,
pour admirer ses œuvres et celles de sa nièce, il y avait Madame Elisabeth.
Was Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister.
Ayant envie d'apprendre l'art du modelage en cire,
wishing to learn the art of modelling in wax, she asked the young Marie to teach it to her.
La princesse finit.
The princess ended up liking her so much that she asked Monsieur Curtius to permit her to join her at the Palace of Versailles.
À résider au palais de Versailles. Pour pouvoir jouir.
So she could permanently enjoy her pleasant company.
Compagnie.
This seems extremely unlikely. She appears nowhere in official records. Marie Grossholtz, the name is nowhere. Even a cursory look at the formality of this very codified and controlled hierarchical system, which was the household. Someone who was making money out of a commercial exhibition in Paris with Curtius would never have access to that intimate circle. But it's very amusing in her memoir because she says things like, the king said to me, "Don't get up, my dear." Well, you know, again, this is extremely unlikely, to put it mildly.
The memoirs then take a dramatic turn. The young Marie's life was about to be turned upside down.
Few events in history have ever caused so intense and permanent a sensation throughout Europe as the French Revolution of 1789. The records of this short but exciting period teem with examples of the most diabolical ferocity.
Rumours of trouble brewing soon reached the waxworks workshop. Like Marie, Philippe Curtius was a monarchist, but as a savvy businessman, he knew he had to change his style to survive. On the 14th of July, 1789, the Bastille was stormed. It was now too dangerous for Marie and her uncle to keep the busts of the royal family on view.
Marie, retire les cires du roi et de la reine et remplace-les par les cires de Mirabeau et de Robespierre. Il ne faudrait pas qu'on nous accuse d'être royalistes. Allez, vite!
The first event that may be cited as the sanguinary commencement of the revolution, Mme Tussaud but too well remembers. The public began to assemble in the streets, demanding the busts of the idols of the people. They were persuasive petitioners, whose appearance was certainly such as plainly indicated they were not to be denied.
Citoyen Curtius, un message de l'Assemblée.
Le camarade Curtius est prié d'exécuter sur le champ de nouveaux bustes en cire des députés de l'Assemblée constituante.
This was the way in which people knew what was happening in the revolution. It was a bit like the 10 o'clock news on television today. Instead of having that, you would go to a wax exhibition to see who was in charge now in the revolution. It was a fast-changing environment as well, so he had to keep swapping the heads around.
In January 1793, Louis XVI himself was guillotined. In March, the Revolutionary Tribunal was created. In September, the Reign of Terror began, with mass executions plunging France into a bloodbath.
Encore une fois. Voilà, parfait.
Merci. Bon.
A decapitated head would be immediately taken to Mme Tussaud, whose feelings can be easier conceived than described. Shrinking with horror, she was compelled to take a cast.
Marie tells us in her memoirs how she sat on the steps of the exhibition making wax models of decapitated, guillotined victims of the revolution. It sounds amazing that Marie could do that. And you think, this is a tall story, load of rubbish. But actually it's substantiated by accounts that other people gave. Astley, and we know that the exhibition did indeed include the heads of wax models of the decapitated revolutionaries, and somebody had to make them. And who was going to make them if Marie didn't?
Although in her memoirs, Marie claims to have been forced to make death masks of the executed, no doubt the grisly displays of the most famous victims would have attracted even more appreciative crowds to her exhibition. Marie was ever the opportunist.
This was all part of a very elaborate self-propaganda of suffering and hardship. She very much casts herself as a victim of terrible, terrible trials and imprisonment and being forced to have bloody heads on her lap to make models of. Also, she gave people, through her own account, a vicarious experience of proximity to celebrity, and it's that vicarious experience of proximity to celebrity that's the foundation of the whole thing.
In 1794, Robespierre, chief architect of the Reign of Terror, was himself guillotined. The country was at war, both internally and beyond its borders.
Voilà. Il faut soutenir la nouvelle République.
As the chaos in France worsened, Marie's uncle was called up to serve as a translator with the French army.
Au revoir, Marie.
After a few months, Curtius returned, very ill. He died shortly after, leaving Marie as his sole heir.
Curtius left his entire estate to Marie, which meant a house in Versailles and the Boulevard du Temple establishment, the Palais Royal having gone, you see. And Marie became then the chief of the business.
Without her mentor, Marie would have to cope alone in a France in turmoil. Fortunately, the waxworks exhibition she had inherited was still a profitable business, and she wasn't alone for very long.
She married an engineer who lived locally. Presumably she'd known him for some time, we don't know. What he liked to do was to buy shares invest in theatres, and he was, frankly, as a husband, a liability. He'd married her unquestionably, not for her looks, but for her money.
Marie could finally lose the name of a family of executioners, as Mademoiselle Grossoz became Mmadame Tussaud.
She didn't make a very good choice of husband. He's wasting her money. He's not interested in running the waxworks. He leaves her to do that.
Marie was already 37 when her first child, Joseph, was born. But her married life wasn't a happy one, and thanks to the revolution, the waxworks business was in trouble too.
The revolution made a waxwork far less attractive because for tourists, Paris became rather a dangerous place to be. And people had less money. Parisians had less money. The economy of Paris was run down during the revolution as well. And the wealthy people who might have gone to the waxworks to have a look at each other in wax were no longer there.
Marie lost her second child, a little girl to be called Marie, at birth. A second son, Francois, was born the following year. The salon's fortunes continued to decline. That could have been the end of the Tussaud story, but one morning in October 1802, a meeting with a family friend was to change the course of Marie's life.
Mesdames, Messieurs.
Paul Philippsthal was an entertainer from Germany who claimed to conduct seances. Exposed as a charlatan there, he had come to Paris to look for a much more susceptible audience keen to contact the dead.
Votre oncle Curtius aurait adoré cette lanterne. Marie, vous avez des bougies et un drap?
Oh, mais oui. Je t'en prie, va chercher un drap.
The magic lantern was a development of the camera obscura, the forerunner of today's slide projector. During the 17th century, it became a fascinating distraction for Europe's well-to-do.
Paul de Philippsthal was quite well off. He travelled around all over Europe presenting these magic lantern shows, which he called the Phantasmagoria. If we look at the word phantasmagoria, it means basically a gathering of ghosts. What happened was an audience would be invited into a room, plunged into complete darkness, and they'd be bombarded with a whole series of images of ghosts and evil spirits.
C'est parti.
Philippe Stahl was looking for other elements to add to his show and thought Marie's wax portraits were just what he needed. He asked Marie to go with him to England.
Marie, who was at the end of her tether with her husband, accepted the offer of Philippe Stahl, who said he would take his Magic Lantern show to London and she could go with him with some of her models and he would pay the costs. He'd take half of her profits, but she'd be better off than struggling on in Paris.
Philippe Stahl was very much a kind of salon magician to begin with. And it was during the time of the Enlightenment, certainly, when there were quite a lot of Freemasons around who had these kind of private clubs, and they were very keen to entertain anybody who had any interest in the new sciences. And, of course, Philippe Stahl could puff himself up and say that he was really a professor of science, and he was a charlatan in many ways, and not a particularly good man, in as much as his only focus was on money.
When Marie arrived in England in 1802 with her young son and her waxworks, there was little in her favor. She did not speak English and only read and wrote French with difficulty. But what she did have was a real talent for wax and business and a sheer determination to succeed. She discovered in the England of the 1800s a country in total transformation, and one with a fascination and disgust for all things French.
The French were depicted by British caricaturists like Gilray and Cruikshank very much as the enemy. Murderers, hostile to the church, hanging churchmen, eating babies. The cartoons are utterly horrific. And Napoleon, as the Emperor of France between 1804 and 1815, was the absolute central figure of detestation for the British. He created this huge empire on the continent. He fought Britain at sea. He was a real threat. So the British saw him as their chief enemy, but they were also fascinated by the power that he exercised in France, because he was, after all, a dictator. The revolution had been rolled up in a man of 5'6".
Napoleon's wax figure became the centerpiece of her exhibition. As always, the importance of conveying character was top of her mind.
As Napoleon once said, it is not the exactness of traits, a wart on the nose, that makes a likeness. It is the character, what animates a person, that it is necessary to portray.
When she arrived in England, one of her unique selling points was that with the Napoleonic Wars, the fascination with Napoleon, she acquired a lot of relics of Napoleon's. That, for example, Napoleon's actual carriage was a sensation. And I think it can be said that the main man in her life, the best relationship with a man, was with Napoleon, because he served her very well, for richer, for richer, for richer.
But Marie's relationship with Philippe Stahl had become a different matter altogether.
Je viens chercher ma part de la recette.
Philippe Stahl, vous êtes injuste. Voilà des mois que vous vous servez dans ma caisse. Vous n'aurez rien.
He holds my nose to the grindstone, seeking only to flout and ruin me so he can take all.
C'est à moi. Non. Rendez-le-moi, c'est à moi. Non. Non.
In 1803, when the Lyceum season was considered to be finished, Philippe Stahl decides that he's going to move into the theatre circuit of Britain, and Edinburgh will be their next stop.
It's a beautiful little city from which one can see snow-covered mountains. I have discovered some compatriots at the castle, and one lady-in-waiting has spent all her life in France.
Why Edinburgh? Edinburgh is obviously the Scottish capital. It's also a big centre for émigrés. That's where the French émigrés have gone for preference. And so the idea is that a show that is exhibiting the King and Queen in all their glory, Napoleon as a real villain, and the revolutionaries as decapitated former villains, will be attractive to the émigrés.
Marie soon heard about the performances of Henri Charles, a renowned French ventriloquist, and went along to see his show.
Allez, venez, venez, approchez, approchez.
Henri and his puppet had already established a strong following amongst the many French émigrés living in Edinburgh at the time, and Marie, whose son Joseph loved the show, saw an opportunity for her to do the same.
Mesdames et messieurs.
Comment tu t'appelles?
Jimmy, je m'appelle Jimmy.
When Mme Tussaud arrived in Edinburgh, discovering that Philippe Stahl had not actually paid for the actual freight of her exhibition, she met up with Charles and asked him to loan her some money. I think he loaned her something like £30, which was quite a lot of money. And Charles really did befriend her in a big way, and there was another move to Ireland.
Marie tours in Ireland, and she follows the pattern of the theatre companies, how they tour during the season of the wealthy elite who, in the summer months, would go to Dublin and to Limerick and to different cities in Ireland.
These fairs were marks of trade. They were commerce. People went from all over Europe to sell their wares. They would go buy cloth. And there was always a rule that the entertainment cannot commence until the trading has stopped. There was also the selling of livestock alongside theatre shows, magic shows, illusion shows, waxwork shows.
Marie learnt not only from the fairs, but from the theatre trade as well.
Marie learned very quickly from how the theatre companies operated. She was very careful when she moved from one town to another to only move when she was not making money. Until 1808, she continued to call it the courteous cabinet of curiosities. And when she arrived, she would have posters produced saying that specially for your town, here is the courteous cabinet of curiosities for your enjoyment. But only for a very limited season. She would always say that. She didn't say, we're here until we ain't making any money, which is what she really meant. Marie had carriages in which she transported all the equipment. But the move, of course, was itself a good advert, because each of the carriages had your name on them and it would indicate where you were going next. So there was travelling adverts.
As she travelled around the country, Marie was careful to always consult the showman's almanac.
Owen's Book of Fairs, a complete and authentic account. Newark, Friday in Mid-Lent, May the 14th, Whit Tuesday, August the 2nd, and every other Wednesday for cattle and sheep.
There was a book published every year called the Owen Book of Fairs, which was actually an almanac of all the fairs that takes place in the United Kingdom. It tells you what date they're in, it tells you when they move, it tells you the distance in miles between each place, and that's what Tussauds would have used to get from place to place.
The new moneyed middle classes were the people Mme Tussaud wanted at her exhibition, and she needed grand venues to attract them. She was always careful to pick the very best rooms, unlike many of the other travelling shows at the time.
A nice salon, well furnished and decorated, for £2 a month. Everyone is astonished by my figures, the equal of which no one has seen here. I am regarded as a great lady here and have everyone on my side.
Her exhibitions would be in the assembly rooms, big, high-ceilinged, large rooms where you could set out the models and people could walk amongst the models and have a feel at the material and touch the headdresses and sit down and natter to each other, listen to the little orchestra that was playing. But if there was not an assembly room, she would use a local theatre, and the theatre would be boarded over and the models would be set up there.
In choosing well-appointed exhibition halls, Mme Tussaud stole a march on her competitors who worked the fairs.
Waxworks were commonplace when Mme Tussaud came to this country, but they were much more associated with the popular entertainment of the fair and anatomical waxes, sensational things. And she very much raised the term of how waxworks could be for a much more middle-class, educational, aspirational form of entertainment and information. When she went on the bad roads, you could say she was a travelling tabloid. She was taking sensation to parts of the country where they were desperate for news.
Marie knew how important good marketing was. She would take particular care over the announcements and catalogues for her exhibitions, which went into remarkable detail.
When you see the catalogues that Mme Tussaud does, she's looking for an educated audience. She's looking for an audience that could read or write. A lot of the people who went to fairs at that time wouldn't be able to read or write. The advertisements you get for the fairs at that time are quite cheap, are more illustrative. But the tradition that Mme Tussaud is going into is more the exhibition tradition rather than the fairground tradition.
She's quite an innovator with these catalogues, would give quite a lot of detail about the different characters. Several pages on Marie Antoinette, for instance. Catalogues would run to 80 pages. Not the sort of single sheet that tell you nothing that you get today. It was really informative.
The cost of producing these catalogues was underpinned by a very clever pricing policy.
The price that she charged was a price that would only be tolerable for a comfortably off middle-class elite. So, sixpence to look at the exhibition, another sixpence to look at the separate room, the Chamber of Horrors, another sixpence for the catalogue, which was very good value. You got your money's worth for your sixpence. She was criticised for her appealing only to elite. And there's a funny poster that you can see where she says that for a special moment, poorer people, working class people, can come to the exhibition for half price, but only between 9:15 p.m. and 10 p.m. The exhibition closed at 10 p.m.
Marie's tours around the United Kingdom were becoming ever more profitable. She continued to send money to her husband, who had remained in France to look after their younger son's education. But he was spending the family silver with little regard for their son's future. The letters he exchanged with Marie were more often about money than anything else. Eventually, the money ran out, and in 1812, Francois was forced to sell the waxworks exhibition in the Boulevard du Temple to one of his creditors.
We shall not write to you about our plans. Adieu, adieu. We can each go our own way. Je suis pour la vie, ta femme, Tussaud.
5 years later, her youngest son decided to join his mother and brother. Marie hadn't seen him since she left for England with Philipsthal and Joseph 15 years earlier. He turned up at the studio, carrying a keepsake to confirm his identity.
Mon Dieu. François.
Tu dois être épuisé. Viens.
Marie's second son, Francois, arrived in London in 1817 when he himself was 17. And then both sons helped in making models.
Francois had been trained as an apprentice carpenter in Paris. This gave him a ready-made role in his mother's business. He would get the job of making arms and legs in wood to add realism to the waxwork busts.
They had to do what she said. They had to obey her instructions, and they were paid virtually nothing. They were virtually her slaves.
To recognize their skill and business sense, the Waxworks exhibition took the name Mmadame Tisou and Sons.
Mme Tussaud kept a very tight control on the purse strings and the apron strings of the business, i.e. she established a matriarchal business. Her sons worked for her, but right up until her death, she was a presence at the exhibition and very much involved in counting the money and in the ledgers, keeping absolute careful track of expenditure.
And she kept a little account book where she wrote down every day what she spent on candles, what she spent on repairing gowns, etc., what she spent on the special adverts, and this is what she spent most money on the adverts, the posters and the adverts in the newspapers.
By 1835, after 3 decades travelling the roads of the United Kingdom, the Mmme Tussaud and Sons exhibition had become a prosperous business. Marie finally had the means to hire an exhibition hall right in the middle of London, in Baker Street.
Marie had toured. From 1803, she constantly toured, adding to the family more and more grandchildren, and they must have got really fed up with the touring. And when Mme Tussaud moved to Baker Street in 1835, she didn't at the time know it was going to be a permanent centre, but to her it was a sort of apex of being in a fashionable, growing, bourgeois cultural area. The assumption was that they'd maybe only stay in Baker Street as they'd stayed in other places for a few weeks, but because they continued to make money, they stayed.
For the 27 years that she was a travelling exhibition, she was so skillful about publicising her exhibition that when she decided she could settle in London, she had established through all that promotional, all the posters and her trail in the newspapers, it meant that she'd established herself as a brand.
When she settled there, where she arrived was a very fashionable centre for London. Oxford Street, the shops were beginning to be constructed. Central London is changing very much at the time. Railways are beginning to be built. It's a time of real transition.
Ever inventive, Marie was determined to keep the public coming in, and she knew exactly what to do.
The most extraordinary relic in the world, the original knife and lunette, the identical instrument that decapitated 22,000 persons.
Marie might like to talk about education and history and her general catalogue, but what most people went to the waxworks for was to be shocked and frightened and look at the dead villains.
When Mme Tussaud came, she introduced an incredibly finer tradition, that her workmanship and her knowledge, and I think also the subject matter. The terrors in France had created a kind of appetite for death and sensation in early Regency London.
Marie's Chamber of Horrors combined the bloody violence of the French Revolution with figures of renowned murderers.
There's nothing like a good murder to attract the crowds. So the Chamber of Horrors, by its very nature, is about murder, and it's all about the great criminals. When you read the catalogues throughout the 19th century, the Chamber of Horrors becomes even more detailed, becomes really the reason people go.
She packaged the gore so that it was cautionary or moral, or she dressed it up so that it wasn't just making people feel they're voyeurs of horror. It was moral. These are murderers, you know, bad men, and, you know, it had an ethical packaging somehow, so it wasn't just cheap thrills as the point.
Her exhibition allowed visitors a glimpse into the hidden world of crime and punishment.
And what made that particularly interesting was when actual executions were no longer public. So if you were going to see someone who'd been a particularly nasty murderer, it was at a waxworks that you'd see them. And you could be fairly sure that the model had been made from the dead head.
Marie had adapted well to the revolution in France, but at heart she was still a monarchist. Now, in 1837, a new queen sat on the British throne, the young Victoria. Mme Tussaud saw an opportunity.
Queen Victoria was enormously important for Madame Tussaud and her exhibition.
Majesté, votre venue est un immense honneur et une consécration pour la modeste artiste que je suis.
Perhaps because Marie was a royalist, the new queen allowed herself to be modelled in wax, complete with replicas of her coronation robes, accurate to the last detail. For Marie, it was the recognition she had sought all her life, and whatever the truth about her stay in Versailles, this time it was for real.
Queen Victoria was undoubtedly, among the monarchs, the central figure, the apex. She was so pleased with the result that she was not at all disturbed when she appeared on the front of the 1841 catalogue, and when she started to have children of her own, she took them to the exhibition. This became a tradition with her. She had a lot of children, as you know, and apparently they all saw the exhibition. And she encouraged other royals, when they were visiting London, to go to the exhibition as well. Mme Tussaud undoubtedly epitomised Victorian ideas on recreational education, on utter respectability. She did typify all that was seen as positive and attractive about Victorian life.
In the heyday of the waxworks, when it was it established itself as a major London landmark and leading attraction, a leading exhibition of the metropolis was how Punch described it. It was a place of great sophistication, a place of refinement, a place that the Duke of Wellington would like to go to. So it was a completely different pitch from the Serpentine queue and looking at the waxworks today.
Surrounded by her sons, Marie established what has since become a landmark for Londoners and visitors from all around the world.
Bien. Mon cher Francis, nous avons presque terminé. Écrivez.
Since Madame Tussaud's residence in the country, not only have her works received the meed of praise from its inhabitants, but her talents have been justly appreciated by a generous and discerning public.
Ont été appréciés par un public aussi généreux qu'éclairé.
When you look at when she wrote her memoirs, it was when she was promoting her permanent new exhibition in London. So it was a brilliant celebrity memoir. It's name-dropping, 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 and then about her early life.
Après 36 ans de
After 36 years of residence,
Londres,
including the last 5 in London, Madame Tussaud is more in fashion than ever.
Épargnée par les massacres,
she has escaped massacres, been freed from prison, been spared the threat of the guillotine, and has now reached a peaceful retirement. Safe and sound, she here takes leave of her readers.
It's, in a way, a load of tripe, a load of absolute rubbish. On the other hand, it's a very good portrayal of what she wanted people to think about her. And that's the value of the memoirs.
We're all our own myth makers to a degree, but she takes it to a different level.
Every great showman creates a myth and a reality at the same time. That's what makes them, stands them above anyone else. Mme Tussaud is probably the earliest woman who creates that myth at the same time as the reality.
Et voilà, madame. La dernière bougie.
Mme Tussaud died in her London home on the 15th of April, 1850, at the age of 89. She was laid to rest in the Church of St. Mary in Cadogan Street.
At the moment of her death, she was obituaried in pretty well all the journals and newspapers, and they agreed without exception that Mme Tussaud was a national institution, which may sound a bit odd, but that was the highest praise you could give for someone, to describe them as a national institution. And to describe a foreigner, a French woman, as a national institution, that was praise indeed.